Good morning, everyone. We're just gonna give people a chance to get in the webinar before we get started. Alrighty. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the GLLC webinar on nitrates in drinking water. My name is Luke Bingaman. I am the Program Associate for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus. I want to go over a few things before we get started. So this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the GLLC website, which is gllc.csgmidwest.org. And then we will be holding a Q&A portion for the panelists at the end of their presentations. At that time, I'll ask you to raise your hand using the raise your hand function at the bottom of this call, and I can unmute you, or you can always put them in the chat throughout the call, and I can read those out loud to the panelists at the end. I would like to now introduce the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus Chair, Illinois Senator Laura Fine, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Senator Fine.
Thank you, Luke. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus and the Council on State Governments Committee on Energy and the Environment. The GLLC coordinates regional action, provides education, and creates a space for collaboration for state and provincial legislators across the binational Great Lakes St. Lawrence region. We work to advance our policy agenda through meetings like these, task forces and committees, and our policy institutes and annual meetings. The GLLC currently has a task force on emerging contaminants, focusing on PFAS and plastics in the Great Lakes waters. And we have also passed recommendations on nutrient management. To further our members' education in these areas, the session today will cover nitrates. The panelists have done a tremendous amount of work researching nitrates and how they've been impacting water supplies around the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River basins, and how policymakers can help to support the health of our watersheds. Before I turn back to Luke to introduce the speakers, I would like to remind everybody that GLLC members that registration is open for our annual meeting, and this year it is in Marquette, Michigan on September 28th and 29th, and there are still a few scholarships available. So I hope you will join me and the rest of the GLLC crew up in Marquette. And now I want to thank you for attending and pass it back to Luke.
Thank you, Senator Fine. I'm now going to introduce our first presenter for the day, Sara Walling from Clean, Wisconsin. I'm going to briefly go over her bio. For 20 years, Sara has worked at the nexus of agriculture and water quality, applying conservation principles and policies to agricultural systems in the Great Lakes region, including over 15 years of direct experience working with farmers, agronomists, NGOs, and county, state, and federal agency partners to improve the environmental footprint of farming systems. Sara is currently the Water and Agriculture Program Director for the state's largest environmental nonprofit organization, Clean Wisconsin, where she is responsible for steering the organization's important work using state, regional, and federal advocacy to protect and improve the quality of our state's lakes, streams, and groundwater. So Sara, can you feel free to take it away, and I will stop sharing, and you can share your slides.
All right. I hope everybody is seeing my intro slide. Thank you for having me, Luke, and I appreciate the setting stage that you did, Senator Fine. So I'm just going to launch right into it. Wisconsin has been experiencing nitrate contamination for quite some time. So this is not a new concern, but certainly an elevated awareness around it. With our huge reliance on groundwater for our drinking water in our state, with over 1,100 public water systems, 800,000 private wells, we look to our groundwater to sustain us as a state very significantly. And nitrates have shown themselves to be our most widespread contaminant in groundwater, with approximately 12 or 10% of private wells exceeding the 10 parts per million health-based standard for drinking water. And this year we have 186 transient systems. So those rural bars, restaurants, and things like that out in the country are well over that number, and 20 public systems this past year had issues where they exceeded the nitrate levels. Those loads are especially high in certain areas of the state, the southwestern, south central, and central regions. So how is this nitrate getting into our water? A little stage setting for both of our talks today. So there's many sources of nutrients that enter our watersheds and environmental systems. Atmospheric is certainly one component, though small. Additionally, sewage and septic wastes, especially if you have faulty or really aging septic systems. But the majority of the nutrient inputs that are entering our watersheds in the system really come through human applied wastes from animal manures and agricultural sources, so fertilizers. That makes up the large majority. Only a small amount of nitrogen that's applied to the soil is actually going to be used, however, though. So corn, as an example, is really only able to take up about half of the nitrogen that's applied to it. So that excess nitrogen that's not being used by the crops then is highly mobile, highly soluble, and has a high tendency, therefore, to leach down through the soil system into tile drains, or all the way down to groundwater systems, or certainly the opportunity to run off the surface and into surface water bodies. When it hits those, of course, it has a lot of potential negative implications. There is the opportunity for those waterways to become overly enriched and eutrophy, as well as a lot of other additional human health risks. In the aquatic systems, we're talking about hazards to fish, amphibians, and invertebrates, where we're lowering the oxygen levels, causing excessive algal growth, and then impairing the aquatic system to kind of maintain itself. Those high nitrogen concentrations, when we are exposed to them as humans through our drinking water, also have been linked to methemoglobin, so blue baby syndrome, as many of us have heard about for quite some time. And that's really what that 10 parts per million was based on when it was initially established as our health-based standard. But we have a growing body of evidence, and we'll talk further about this today, that even at low levels of nitrate exposure through drinking water systems, there are correlations to reproductive health problems, thyroid diseases, and cancers. And in Wisconsin, more than 90% of the nitrate pollution that we are experiencing in the state has been linked to agricultural sources, those manure and commercial fertilizer uses. Why is that? Well, Wisconsin is a very agricultural state, as are many within the Great Lakes region, most certainly. We have about 14 million acres of ag land, most of which is under corn and soybean production. We also rank really high, of course, in our cheese as the cheese state and related associated dairy products. But corn silage to feed our agricultural or livestock population is another big component of our crop system. And to that end, we have 1.27 million dairy cows on about 5,300 herds. That number of dairy cows has really not changed a lot over the last 20 years that I've been working in Wisconsin, but the number of farms that have those dairy herds are much reduced. We were around 12 to 13,000 when I first started in Wisconsin in 2006, and we're down to about 5,300. So the farms are consolidating considerably while keeping those animal units. And then similarly, we have a very high degree of poultry and other livestock in the state. Nitrate losses are going to vary based on many factors, from soil type, precipitation, if we're using irrigation, and those kind of things. But that excess nitrogen that the plants just really are not capable of taking up is therefore kind of around in the system and has the opportunity to leach into groundwater or run off and move into surface waters. Certainly, there's also a very significant groundwater surface water interaction where groundwater feeds a lot of our surface water systems in the state. So it ends up being a bit of a connection system there that way. Excuse me. Compounding this problem is often an imbalance, therefore, in the amount of nitrogen that's needed for crop production and the amount of manure and nitrogen fertilizer that's actually applied. So interesting to consider that we've always had agriculture. So really what's changed? Well, since the 1960s, we have seen an incredible increase in the amount of nitrogen fertilizer production globally. So this is a graph demonstrating the amount of nitrogen fertilizer being produced across the globe by continent region, if you will. And this was really spurred in the 1930s by the Huber-Bosch method that changed our agricultural use of manures and plant biomass from the crop itself as that organic matter nitrogen source to a commercial fertilizer. And so the amount has more than tripled since the 1960s, when that commercial fertilizer really made its way into and integrated itself into our agricultural systems in the US. Similarly, livestock production has increased at the similar rate over time, and this is for the United States, but just demonstrates how our livestock production has also grown. And with increases in livestock production, you also have an increase in manure production. And importantly, in our state, as an example, where we have a lot of dairy, our cows have also gotten a lot more productive. They used to be, producing a low amount of milk per animal unit, if you will, and that has more than tripled over the last several decades. And as that does, so does the manure that those animals are generating and the nitrogen that is included and contained within that manure. So our study, which is what we were brought here today to talk really about, was called Nitrates on Tap. And it really was a case study to help us increase awareness around the nitrate impacts that to our drinking water systems in the state. PFAS has really has taken a lot of the energy when it comes to understanding and thinking about drinking water impacts in our state, and rightly so. It's a very concerning emerging contaminant, but as a result, nitrates had kind of dropped off, and the awareness around this issue and this chronic exposure that many of our residents are experiencing was kind of lost. So we wanted to reinvigorate the discussion around nitrates and what we can do about them. So as such, we entered into this process, this case study with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, to estimate the cost to ratepayers within public water systems to treat for nitrates. We also wanted to estimate the amount of crop nitrogen need per year versus the annual availability and application of manure and fertilizer. We also wanted to elevate those experiences from private well owners who are left behind in our state because they aren't protected and don't really have easy access to resources to remediate nitrate contamination in their wells. And then using all of this information and awareness build to motivate farmers to implement crop management changes to reduce nitrate losses, and then identify additional policy options to protect our drinking water. We did this through a number of different avenues, through community input from private well owners and really getting into conversation and visiting them in their homes and understanding their experiences, quantifying the treatment costs for municipal water systems. We went into it hoping to do this at a statewide level. However, obtaining data from municipal water systems about the costs, initial upfront as well as ongoing to treat for nitrates, proved to be extremely challenging. And so we were able to really mine that data for 4 municipal systems in various locations across the state to get a feel for what this looks like. We also assessed a range of private well expenses, did that simplified mass balance approach to estimate the whether over-application of nitrogen is likely happening or not, and then reviewed Wisconsin's current regulatory and incentive programs and analyzed nutrient management requirements across the Great Lakes states. Might as well grab good ideas where they sit. So in doing so, the private well review and case study situation really proved very enlightening. We ended up really recognizing the everyday challenges that nitrate contamination creates for private well owners in our state, and the concerns and stress that really induces, not to mention the cost to private well owners to replace those wells. Those costs range from $22,000 to replace a well in total, to $10,000 to $15,000 over the course of several years to treat their well water and continue to do replacements and RO and filtration in their RO systems. When it came to the Wisconsin public water systems, again, we were able to really dig in with some of those municipal water system managers to understand how they made decisions about whether or not they were going to replace a well, institute a blending between less contaminated wells and overly contaminated, or provide treatment filtration technology within the treatment plant itself to address this issue. Those activities were different across the board by the community, and we're still working with these municipalities and others to really understand what that decision-making process is and how we as a state can support that. The costs ranged, as you can tell from this table, quite dramatically, depending on the choice that the municipality entered into to be able to remediate their well water. Overall, it amounted to nearly $50,000 in expenses just for these 4 systems to treat the water. In that case, as you're seeing in the far right column here, in some cases, it's working pretty well. Trempolo was able to drill a much deeper well and access an aquifer without nitrate contamination. Plovers has remained relatively stable, but still very near the 10 ppm nitrate standard. Janesville similarly has remained relatively stable, but is still above the preventative action limit of 5 parts per million, which is disturbing. And then the Chippewa Falls well is still rising. So they will likely be looking at additional remediation steps in the near future to address that increase. So the results of our case study were really that ratepayers are spending millions each year to remove nitrates from their public water systems that they didn't create or generate, and an issue, a burden that really wasn't of their making. Private well owners are being exposed to high nitrate levels and costs to remediate without a lot of state support through any well compensation, because the way that our well compensation program is structured, eligibility restrictions really make it nearly impossible to access that program at this time. And then more nitrogen is being applied to ag fields than crops can utilize. Our study, where we did that simplified mass balance approach, indicated that as many as 16 million pounds of nitrogen as out there being applied to crops, beyond the need that those crops have to be productive and have a solid yield each year. So where does this come for us as an environmental advocacy organization and really digging in on policy solutions for these kinds of issues? We have a series of recommendations in the report that range from short-term, mid-term, and long-term recommendations. So in the short term, we would like to see the state create a well testing program. Very few private well owners actually test their wells for nitrates and bacteria and pesticides. There's a cost impediment certainly to this, as well as access to those testing programs. Not every county has the capacity to do that within their public health system. And so we'd like to see a statewide well testing program instituted. We'd also have a slew of eligibility changes that we'd like to see to that well compensation program so that more private well owners can access those resources and fully fund it so that we have the funding available to support as many homeowners as possible that choose to test their wells and address their contamination issues. We'd also really like to see for those public systems revamping and a expansion of our wellhead protection planning and implementation process and authorities so that more municipalities can look at their source water contribution areas around each of their wells, identify potential contamination sources, and make land use and land management changes within those zones to really be that longer term solution. So we're not just putting Band-Aids on the problem at the treatment side at the tap, but are reducing the flow of nitrates into those water systems in the first place. To do that, we could also really benefit from expanding groundwater mapping efforts and prioritize public systems for that mapping to help identify those contribution zones where we are already seeing increased nitrate in the source water for those systems. And then certainly throughout this, we're intending to continue to expand education and outreach on nitrate contamination with our legislators, decision makers at the agencies, and then certainly within the public, and really working harder to access and build partnerships and relationships in rural communities where we're seeing extensive nitrate contamination issues. One way we're doing that at Clean Wisconsin is through these water quality report maps, one of which is depicted here, that we produced at the state level for legislative districts, as well as at the federal level for congressional districts, to identify many surface and groundwater contaminant issues that those populations are experiencing. So on this map, for instance, you can see that it includes everything from pesticide detects, but also the nitrate exceedances that are happening and whether or not any drinking water systems, public systems in that region experienced excessive levels of nitrate during the reporting period. In the medium term, we'd certainly like to see standardized groundwater monitoring. We do have the ability to monitor our largest animal feeding operations for groundwater contamination. And we've just started implementing that through permits over the last several years. So the map on the left identifies all of our largest CAFOs within the state. Those are over 1,000 animal units, though we have many hundreds more that are just below that permitting level. And then the stars, which you can see a few of on here, are places, CAFOs, where we have groundwater monitoring in place to be able to quantify and at least represent and understand more about what the losses look like from those livestock production areas. We'd also like to see expanded public water system reporting so that we can get a better handle on what the costs are to ratepayers, and increasing public access to our water quality data is extremely important. So everybody has an understanding of what might be impacting their public health and their communities. And then creating a pay for performance cost share program for producers who are able to quantify actual nutrient losses from crop management changes they implement. And then lastly, in the longer term, we're certainly looking to reevaluate whether or not the nitrate drinking water standard of 10 parts per million is indeed protective of public health. A great degree of study has been done since that level was established. And it's very much indicating, as Michael and Kerri will go into, the correlations between even chronic low-level exposure to significant human health risks. We're also looking to establish stronger fertilizer and manure application restrictions, especially in high contamination areas. Developing surface water nitrate standards for specific water bodies is similarly on that long-term list. Increasing accountability over nutrient management plan implementation for our farms is an ongoing issue and process that will certainly take some time, but it's something we're continuously digging our teeth into. And then creating a potential statewide manure hauler program to better train applicators, create a tracking system, and also be able to help move that manure around the state a little further so that we don't have the concentrated applications in areas of the state with especially high livestock populations. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass this over to Michael so he can pick up where I left off.
I'm going to introduce Michael really quick, and Kerri, and then hate to break up the clean transition, but I want to introduce them. So thank you for that, Sara. That was fantastic. But next I'm going to introduce Kerri and Michael from the Iowa Environmental Council. Kerri Johannsen is the Senior Director of Policy and Programs with the Iowa Environmental Council, providing strategic oversight and advocacy strategy across the council's energy, climate initiatives, and water programs. She has 2 decades of experience in energy and environmental policy and has previously served as the Council's Energy Program Director, as well as the Manager of Government Affairs. Kerri previously served as professional staff with the U.S. Senate Agricultural Committee, administered the Iowa Power Fund for innovative clean energy product projects, and worked as an analyst and legislative liaison with the Iowa Utilities Commission before joining the council in 2016. Kerri was a visiting researcher with the Florence School of Regulation in Florence, Italy, in the summer of 2024. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Gustavus Adolphus College and a Master's in Public Policy from the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. Michael Schmidt joined the council in 2019 and works across the IEC's water, energy, and climate program areas. He previously worked in Minnesota on clean water and mining issues through enforcement, permitting, rulemaking, and legislative actions. He has a law degree from the University of Minnesota and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Iowa. Kerri and Michael, you feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Luke. I will be sharing my screen here. We are here to talk about the environmental risk factors in Iowa's cancer crisis, which is a report that the Iowa Environmental Council put out earlier this year in partnership with the Harkin Institute at Drake University. We decided to produce this report and do this research because Iowa has the second highest rate of new cancer diagnoses in the United States and is one of only 3 states where cancer rates are increasing instead of being stable or decreasing. So Iowa is an outlier compared to other states, and we were concerned about what might be making that happen, which led to the Cancer and Environmental Risk Factors project that Kerri helped lead. So I will hand it off to Kerri to introduce that project and some of the high-level findings from that.
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, we started the Cancer and Environmental Risk Factors project after, since 2023, Iowa had been ranked second for the rate of new cancers. And experts in cancer are really clear that multiple factors contribute to a person's cancer risk. However, while some risk factors were being openly discussed in our state, like smoking, alcohol consumption, and UV radiation, other potential causes weren't really part of the discussion. And that is really what motivated us to take a rigorous review of the scientific research about environmental risk factors associated with cancer to get a more complete picture of cancer in our state and to understand what was going on. We also did a series of listening sessions to find out about the real world experiences of Iowans beyond the statistics. So IEC worked really closely with the Iowa Farmers Union on those listening sessions. And we held 16 of these, including a virtual session in areas across the state. We spoke to about 600 Iowans and found that 80% of the folks that we spoke with didn't feel like they had enough information about what environmental risk factors might be at play. Next slide, Mike. On the literature review side, we started by convening a panel of scientists, environmental health experts, epidemiologists, and oncologists to determine the focus of the report and where Iowans' environmental exposures might be higher than other places. They recommended that we focus on pesticides, PFAS, nitrate, and radon, and these are the primary carcinogens covered in our report. Over the course of a year, we reviewed more than 250 studies and analyzed data from long-term research that was published in professional journals. We also went through a rigorous review process that involved more than a dozen state and national experts providing feedback on the report. And the work culminated in our finished report that was published in March. Next slide. So I'm going to share, Mike and I are going to share a few of the report findings, and we're really going to focus today on the section covering nitrate. Go ahead. So just to give you an overview of what we are seeing in Iowa. So around 2012, 2014, something really started to change in the direction of cancer incidence in our state. We were diverging from national trends of decline since about 2007, but obviously we've had this increasing rate since about the middle of the 2010s. And it has only recently started to receive more attention as we hit number 2 for the last few years. So we know that lifestyle factors definitely are something that are a part of the picture, but we also needed to look at other carcinogens. When it comes to cancer, an environmental carcinogen can impact our body in a couple of ways. Our cells are always replicating and making new cells, and there are always mutations that are happening. Most of the time, our immune system comes in and quickly fixes those mutations, and we go on as normal. But exposure to a carcinogen in the environment can cause additional mutations to happen more frequently. It can also suppress our immune response. And so one analogy we like to use is a bank of light switches, where each exposure flips on a light switch. And the more light switches you flip on, the more likely it is that you're going to end up with developing cancer. And so we see that Iowans increased exposure to carcinogens should be seen as a risk factor in our state. And we looked more closely at some specific ones. But the other piece of this, and you can go to the next slide, Mike, that's really concerning and that really made us look hard at these environmental carcinogens in Iowa, is that we are seeing rising cancer incidence in people under 50 years old. And again, Iowa is second nationally in cancer incidence among this group of folks. And so this is really, it's been typical to see cancer develop in older people, but this rise in incidence in people under 50 has been an especially troubling red flag for us in Iowa. And I will pass it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Kerri. So one of the areas that we focused on was nitrate, because Iowa is an outlier in nitrate, as I'll get into. Nitrate itself is not a carcinogen. When it's ingested, it travels through the body and can convert into other compounds, and those can be carcinogenic. When it is eaten with antioxidants, then instead chemical reactions can turn it into beneficial compounds. But if it is in drinking water sources or processed meat, then you might not have those antioxidants and other nutrients, and instead it forms those carcinogenic compounds that can lead to DNA damage, cell mutation, and ultimately cancer. So the source of the nitrate matters, and drinking water is one of the sources that can be a problem in terms of cancer development. We are primarily exposed to nitrate through drinking water, and that is where we see Iowa is an outlier in the United States. Only 7% of the nitrate in our surface water is from point sources like municipal and industrial wastewater. 93% is from non-point sources, primarily agriculture in Iowa. This has led to a steady increase in nitrate concentrations in our major waterways, which you can see on this chart here, going from more natural concentrations below 1 milligram per liter up to 6 or 7 or more in the last few decades. We've seen peaks in the last few years in major rivers of 20 milligrams per liter. Iowa has the most subsurface tile drainage of any state, with about 13 million acres tile drained, and combined with the loss of 98% of our wetlands, the tile drainage channels nitrate directly into our waterways. So Iowa is an outlier in this respect, but the intensification of agriculture in the region is not unique. So if other states move in this direction, you might see similar outcomes. Another way that Iowa is an outlier is the number of concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, in the state. EPA does an inventory, and Iowa has 2.5 times more CAFOs than any other state based on EPA's inventory. A recent analysis by EWG estimated that Iowa has closer to 15,000 animal feeding operations if you include smaller facilities below the threshold that EPA counted, which is, again, more than any other state. The livestock in these facilities generate almost 110 billion pounds of manure annually, which is spread on the ground as fertilizer. And that is in addition to about 12 billion pounds of synthetic fertilizer. We ultimately put a lot more nitrate or nitrogen on the ground than the crops can use. Most of our concentrated animal feeding operations have pretty limited oversight. Only about 200 have permits under the Clean Water Act. Most do not have much other operational oversight. We have also seen that there are leaks, spills, and excess application of manure contributing to the nitrate contamination, with about double the number of manure releases reported as the number of facilities with Clean Water Act discharge permits. This creates an enormous challenge for public water suppliers as well as private water supplies. Only 4% of public water suppliers have treatment capability to remove nitrate. And so most Iowans receive drinking water from systems that use no method or some other method like blending to address nitrate. Iowans who get their water from private wells, as shown on this map, also have some serious problems, with every purple dot on this map showing a well that tested above 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. Iowa has a very strong well testing program run by counties, which is why in some counties you might see few tests or almost no tests because the county doesn't have capacity to operate the program. But most counties do have that capacity, and it shows where we have significant contamination risk across the state. EPA's drinking water standard is 10 milligrams per liter, but that is not based on cancer risk. It was identified more than 60 years ago to address short-term problems, not these long-term effects. The cancer site that has been studied the most with respect to nitrate and is most strongly associated is colorectal cancer. But there are other connections that have been identified through large-scale population studies and also long-duration studies. The list here includes all of the red cancer sites that are rising in Iowa or exceed the national rate. So all but ovarian that are associated with nitrate are high or rising in Iowa. We also have some of the top 5 fastest rising cancers and the most common cancers in Iowa. So there is both the biological connection and evidence in the outcomes that suggests this is a problem in Iowa. Considering all that, we looked at what can we do about it, how do we address this, and came up with 5 categories of recommendations that I will walk through with some specific recommendations under each category that relate to nitrate. First, in terms of the standards and enforcement that we have, we need to reevaluate the nitrate drinking water standards, both at the state level and federal level, because we know that the standard in place now does not account for those long-term health effects. We also need enforceable watershed management action plans based on modeling and BMP analysis so that we can identify exactly where the nitrate is coming from and how we can address it. This is a site-specific problem because not every field is the same, not every nitrate application approach is the same, so we need smaller scale analysis of how to get at this large scale problem. In terms of regulatory reform, many states have administrative penalty caps, and when I was working in Minnesota, the state raised the penalty cap from $10,000 to $20,000, in part to reflect inflation, but not every state has done that. Iowa has not, for example. Our penalty cap of $10,000 has been the same since 1992. We also need to develop nitrogen fertilizer requirements based on groundwater nitrate. We have seen increasing nitrate in those private wells, and at some point that should trigger some kind of response to protect the wells and access to drinkable water. We also need to reform tile drainage oversight, such as requiring installation of best management practices with tile drainage or consideration of environmental factors. Some states have some degree of this in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes, but there is room for improvement in all states. This is something that IEC looked at several years ago, comparing regulations in different states and identifying how each state could improve. We also need better data. We have a lot to work with, but more data is often helpful. In Iowa, we need real-time water quality monitoring because we have rivers regularly exceeding that drinking water standard, and we have public water suppliers drawing from those rivers. Other states with the same degree of contamination might need similar monitoring approaches. We need more transparency for manure application. Manure management plans guide where manure is put on the land, but those are not always very easy to access. They might not be up to date. So we need more understanding of where the nitrate is going on the land. Another approach to this could be a state right to know law where people can have access to that data, or there's a better expectation of transparency. States in the region could make investments in their water and soil, things like improving the farm bill and changing the incentives in that, identifying how states want those changes to be made to address pollution issues. And Iowa has more private well testing than most states. In Iowa, we still have gaps, and we would like those filled. Other states could adopt a program similar to Iowa's. And finally, in terms of research opportunities, we believe that independence of university researchers is critical. They are often seen as reliable, independent voices, but they might not actually have the degree of independence that people assume. And we need to increase the research overall on environmental risk factors, including nitrate and other contaminants as well. If you would like to see the full report, you can scan this, and that provides a link to the full report. We also have an executive summary and encourage you to take a look at that with more detail. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kerri. That was fantastic. We're now going to start the Q&A portion. So once again, you can put those in the Q&A chat box or the regular chat box, or you can use the raise your hand function, and I can give you audio access, and you can ask your question to the panelists. And it doesn't look like we have any outstanding questions right now, so I will kick it off while people get those in. It seems that a lot of your guys' recommendations are going to come from the state level, and all three of you can pop in and answer this question. How do you feel that the federal level can help support the state actions and also the local level supporting state actions and vice versa? How can the state support local county health departments handle the nitrate issue?
I can take a first stab at that, and then Mike and Kerri, you guys can pitch in. I think, we've been looking to the federal level to do that risk assessment of the nitrate public health standard for quite some time. That process was initiated several years ago, and I think 2017, and then was halted restarted again during the Biden administration and never completed at that point, and then hasn't, been completed since. And so we, I think, really rely as states a lot on the federal government to establish those base standards that then we can work from and work off of. So I know from our perspective, that would be a significant support and help to just looking at this chronic issue that Mike and Kerri's part of our presentations today really pointed out as that chronic low-level exposure that we're seeing, and really get a better handle on what a public health standard should look like.
I think one of the other things we've talked about a lot at IEC is the importance of the federal farm bill. The way that we incentivize or formulate our support for agriculture has driven us into an intensive row crop system in Iowa. And that's very chemical intensive at this point. And so we want to see, more support for more diverse rotations that can help us reduce our overall use of chemicals. We really need to see that work happening upstream so that all of the expense doesn't fall on the water ratepayers to clean it up where it comes out in the rivers and surface water and groundwater. So that's what I would say was another big federal role here.
Great. Thank you guys. We got a couple questions here in the chat. First question is it possible that Iowa could litigate and fertilizer companies to recuperate monies similar to how PFAS litigation has been awarded large sums to states for treatment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It is a little challenging because in Iowa law, agriculture is exempt from almost everything. So trying to go after, the individuals has not worked. Going after drainage districts has not worked because Iowa law very much restricts the liability of the agriculture industry, kind of from top to bottom. So I guess that is a possibility, but there have been other cases that have tried to get at this issue in other ways, and the courts have generally said, well, this is more of a political question. There's not a program for the court to force implementation of, and the court can't just create one out of whole cloth.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Next question, is there a particular state or province that stands out as a good model to follow?
I often point to Minnesota in my work in Iowa, in part because I worked there for quite a while. But Minnesota has done a number of things that Iowa could adopt. For example, in developing drainage, environmental considerations are one of the pieces in the decision process, and drainage districts can install best management practices. Whereas in Iowa, drainage districts are only charged with getting water downstream and nothing else. And so things like that can make a difference, because if you have best management practices, you might have less water going downstream, you might have more retention. That can lead to nitrate removal. So just opportunities like that can make a difference. And Minnesota has led in that in terms of drainage and riparian buffers. And they have a constitutional amendment that provides funding for water quality monitoring and funding best management practices. So I think that is a model that I often point to, in part from my own experience with it.
I'd just add to Mike's comment on Minnesota in that, and this last part is they've really invested at the state level really significantly in supporting environmental issues, along with many others through their Clean Water and Conservation Fund that also supports the arts and other things. But a significant amount of that money goes to support agricultural programs and incentives to do more. It supplies funding for staffing at the agencies to really provide accountability, and a lot of the back and base science around groundwater mapping and other components like that that are really fundamental for us to get a better handle on where the hotspots are, what's causing some of those, and what the best alternative management practices can be to address the problems in those specific areas. So we'd really love to see a similar type of investment made in our state to be able to, frankly, fill gaps to and where the federal government funding can't and hasn't been able to reach.
Great, thank you guys. Next, this question says, in Oregon, we have a high nitrate problem as well, associated with the same issues you guys mentioned. Do you think the population growth has some factor in the rise of the nitrates?
At least in Iowa, we have had fairly flat population levels for decades. And based on our nutrient reduction strategy, the vast majority of nitrates are coming from non-point sources. The point sources have had permit limits imposed since we adopted the nutrient reduction strategy. So I don't think population is a big factor in Iowa. We also are not growing much food for people in Iowa. We primarily grow field corn and soybeans, and that goes to feed livestock. So we are not really feeding a lot more people with what we're growing, at least not feeding them directly. And we have not had population growth during the time that we've seen this significant rise in nitrate concentrations.
In Wisconsin, I'd say I'm not speaking to the population growth piece so much, but to Michael's point is, similarly, I think our point sources are not the big contributor to our surface or groundwater nitrate issues. However, the animal production, so in our state for dairy products, meat products from hog production, chickens for eggs and broilers, et cetera. I think, we've become a society that's very connected to eating meat. And as such, to Mike's point, a lot of our crop production goes to feed those animals. So as our population grows and our appetite for meat products and dairy products, et cetera, has also grown with that. I think it's sort of this constant loop system too. And, while we're talking about our individual states, as Kerri mentioned, a lot of the issues around food production are at the, national and global level, and making, consumer choices about what we want to eat, and therefore what our agricultural producers are growing, and kind of shoring up some of those policies between the Farm Bill programs and the commodity programs that are supporting our current ag systems, and then looking for alternatives. Would be something really important to continue to focus on for our policymakers, so that we can better size the right size and align some of those issues.
Great, thank you guys. Next, how has climate change impacted this issue? In other words, how have much more significant rain events in recent years compounded this?
In Wisconsin, we have a really strong discovery farms program and other edge of field and producer-led watershed efforts that are trying to quantify a lot of that. And, of course, what we're seeing is nutrient management has its place, because it's really trying to address that chronic nutrient losses. And so making sure that your tillage isn't so aggressive that it's creating additional runoff, those kinds of things. But what we're finding is that the intense rainfall events are what is driving a lot of our nutrient contributions to surface and groundwater. And so as our climate changes, we aren't seeing those slow all-day rainfalls as much as we used to, and instead our precipitation is coming through in big storm cells that drop a lot of precipitation in a short amount of time and are causing a lot of the acute runoff and fast leaching of nitrates down to our groundwater.
I was going to say in Iowa, I think that goes both ways. Like in terms of we're seeing more drought on the western side of the state, and with less water, you can end up with higher nitrate concentrations. There's just less water for it to go into, and so of course the concentration then is higher. We've seen extreme rainfall events actually in some cases mitigate high nitrate levels as there's more water to absorb the nitrate. But we've also seen years of heavy rainfall wash nitrate out of the soil that's been sitting there for some time. And when the drought breaks, then you get a wash of nitrate. This last year, we've just had a really steady situation with high nitrate levels for the entire year, where Des Moines Waterworks has been having to treat the water almost every single day since the beginning of the year. And so it's becoming a more steady state of the high being normal, even through these kind of ebbs and flows of the weather and climate change. And I don't know if Mike had anything to add, but that's my.
Great. Is there any research on GMO crops being able to utilize more of the extra nitrogen that is being applied?
I know Iowa State has been looking at this, Iowa State University, and there are increases in nitrogen use efficiency by crops, and that theoretically means less should be going downstream, or you can produce more with less nitrogen applied to the crops. But we have not seen decreases in nitrogen application rates. We still have an excess of total nitrogen being applied to the land, even with the crops using more and increasing yields. So it may have some effect, but at least in Iowa, we are more than offsetting that effect.
And I think part of that is the timing of applying nitrogen. If there's nothing on the field when you're applying it, there's nothing to take it up.
Ditto. Same situation for Wisconsin.
Great. We had a question in the chat that I wanted to ask you guys. Do you guys have a farming background? Come from a farming background, either of you guys?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm in Northeast Iowa. My family still farms up there. For now, they're working through it. It's not a good time, but yes, that's where I come from.
And I did not grow up on a farm, but I lived in a very agriculturally intensive area in Minnesota, and have always worked with farmers and within USDA and Agriculture Research Service, and hand in hand in field studies with farmers to understand how best management practices can mitigate agricultural runoff issues and nutrient and pesticide losses. So that's been the entirety of my career until the last couple of years, moving into Clean Wisconsin. Working here in Minnesota, Iowa, and Minnesota, Indiana, and now Wisconsin.
I grew up in Des Moines, so I'm the outlier here. And my parents are both from farms in Northeast and Northwest Iowa, so almost all of my uncles farm and some of my cousins as well. So I'm familiar with it, but did not grow up on a farm.
Great. Thank you, guys. Last question here. Wouldn't a CAFO be considered point source? What incentives could be put in place to help the farmers treat nutrients at the farm before it gets spread out into the land/water bodies?
I'm sure Kerri and Mike will have something to say on this too, but in Wisconsin, our CAFOs are considered point sources. They're given a permit, but the intention there is that they are not discharging anything to waters of the state. And so that is the presumption, and the requirements are intended to do that from their production areas. But land application of nutrients and manure to farm fields is not included in that coverage. And so there is a stormwater exemption that would say that as you apply nutrients to fields, the weather has a factor. And so that is what is kind of keeps them out of the regulatory loop for the nutrient application to fields. If they are demonstrating groundwater or surface water discharges from the production area, that's where the permit kicks in. I would also say, as far as incentives go, I mean, we have quite a few incentives in place right now through state and federal programs, as Kerri mentioned, the Farm Bill programs that support conservation practices. But those funds cannot possibly go as far as they need to really address the issues. Not to mention, they're not always prioritized as well as they could be to really work with farms that might be causing, or creating some of the biggest issues. And then lastly, I would say that, as we look at potential regulatory mechanisms, or certainly like, I've seen some messages in the chat and some of the questions around like, putting the nutrient manufacturers, the fertilizer companies on notice and charging them, et cetera. But what we're finding, we have a fertilizer tonnage program here in Wisconsin, and it's just not, those funds are really being utilized for a number of different things and not for these kinds of purposes. And in the long run, the cost of that really goes back down to the farmer anyway. That cost is transferred down from those companies onto the farmer in those cases. And we want to be very cognizant of that because we love our state's farmers and want to maintain the agricultural heritage we have in the state.
Great. Thank you, guys. We are going to wrap up. I just want to put some of these upcoming events on everyone's radar. Thank you for coming today to the webinar. Again, this recording will be posted later today, maybe early next week at the latest. If you have any questions, reach out. And thank you all, and thank you to our presenters and to Senator Fine for speaking. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.